Hello, thanks for being in a new video. This time I have full review of the Xiaomi Redmi 13C. Let's get started. This is an entry-level device, although in Mexico, Xiaomi has inexplicably set a higher launch price than we expected. Its price in this region is 3,699 pesos. If you are outside of Mexico, this will seem like a very high price. Even within Mexico, it seems more expensive than it should be. Especially considering that it has as its biggest competitor the Poco M6 Pro, a device from the same manufacturer Xiaomi, but that is going to offer much better things. So from my point of view, it makes no sense at all to buy this device. If you want a Xiaomi, the Poco M6 Pro will definitely be a much better choice. This device should cost much less, but it also faces other competitors from other manufacturers that are, truth be told, interesting considering the closeness of their price. Xiaomi currently has a fairly widespread distribution officially, although probably if you look for it in unofficial distributors, also the price is going to be much more attractive for how low it can be. So join me to know what Xiaomi can offer us in this device. Although, again, throughout the video, you will probably hear me say many times that for the price at which it is distributed in Mexico, it is not worth much, but if you find it at a lower price, it can probably become a better option. So, join me in getting started. The front design won't get to be too attractive, considering that it still has a notch drop and that the bottom bezel is considerably thick, although it is what we would expect in a device of this price. In this regard, it doesn't come as too much of a surprise. Fortunately, it has Gorilla Glass 3 as a level of protection on this front cover. So, it could manage to offer something acceptable in terms of resistance, although obviously again at this price we do not expect something very supreme resistance. On the right side we find the power button, which at the same time is a fingerprint reader along with the volume buttons. At the top is placed the headphone jack, and on the left side is the tray where we can place 2 nano SIM cards and a micro SD card. Although if you buy this device with a phone company in Mexico, it is likely that the second slot is blocked. Finally, at the bottom is placed a microphone, the USB port, and the speaker. The back cover is quite attractive for its satin design, which does have some reflections from the lighting, plus it does not get to mark fingerprints easily. The area that is more reflective, which may even reflect the image, is the area of the camera module that does not have any kind of relief. It just has a different finish. So, on an aesthetic level, I find it a very nice device. In addition, it is 8.09 millimeters thick and weighs 192 grams. So I think it complies in these aspects. In this case, I have the navy blue color, but it's also available in sunset black and clover green. So the color availability is also a point that can become strong. The screen is 6.74 inches with HD plus resolution, so it's not going to give us a very high level of detail. This is something that we find in the most economical devices today, but at the launch price in Mexico is something we can hardly accept. In fact, it is an LCD screen that, as you realize, offers us somewhat poor viewing angles. If we turn the device, practically all the content is no longer displayed, so it is a device very much intended for personal use. But if you are thinking of sharing a video or something similar with friends, those who are watching the content from the side, believe me, they will not be able to see anything at all. The colors will also be simple, they will not have such a high saturation, and obviously the contrast will not be very high either. But that's what we would expect from an entry-level device. It is capable of reaching a brightness of up to 600 nits, which obviously for the entry-level range may be somewhat expected. But it is not a screen that is going to have a very good outdoor display. Although remember that from the front it has a very good brightness, but from the side it loses a lot of brightness. On the other hand, the lowest brightness I think doesn't get as low as we would like for comfortable use in the evenings. So it's a simple screen in all respects. Fortunately, it offers several different color calibration modes, so you can choose the one you like best. In my case, I think I prefer the standard calibration because in the vivid color calibration, you get to see a very cold screen which can become more annoying to the eyes. Speaking of that, it also integrates a reading mode that, as you know in Xiaomi, not only has a color filter, but also gives you the feeling of texture because you can add in this part a texture similar to paper to have a display that does not get to tire you so much. So in software, it does give us a good experience and this could be a strong point. And finally, the refresh rate is 90 Hz. In this sense, I think that it can really meet the requirements of a 2024 device. So we can get to offer smooth animations, and also at the time of sliding on the screen can all look more fluid than normal. So it is a screen that almost nowhere stands out except in the refresh rate and in the reading mode software. The device only integrates a speaker, so it has mono sound. It is not going to be very remarkable. Like all devices in this range, it won't be able to offer us a sound of too much quality. But let's listen to a test, although remember that it is not the same to listen to it live. Honestly, with the standard equalization, the sound does not please me, but fortunately it does let us access an equalizer without the need to have headphones connected. And making this adjustment, I personally find the sound more pleasant, although obviously you can use any other sound preset. Fortunately, this equalizer is 10 bands, so it allows you to modify very well the type of sound that is emitting the speaker to improve it in case you do not like how it sounds normally. Although you should know that the volume is not very high, so although you can get to correct the sound style a bit, there is no way to increase the volume further. Also, it does come with Xiaomi sound, but it doesn't have Dolby Atmos, so it's another feature you won't be able to enjoy even with headphones plugged in. The experience then is simple in this case. Although remember that it does have headphone jack and that can become something positive, but if you want to use wireless headphones, you only have the simple SBC and AAC codecs, so the APK codec is not available. Also, it only integrates a microphone, and this is something we see only in the cheaper devices of all series. So this is a feature that I did not like, considering that other devices in this same price range launching from Mexico will have 2 microphones. Let's listen to a test recorded with this microphone.
Esta es una grabación de audio realizada con el único micrófono que tiene el Xiaomi 13C. Si llegas a tapar este micrófono va a haber muchos problemas.
The recording is obviously going to be simple, and you have to be careful not to cover this microphone because otherwise it will not be able to pick up the audio. Below we will see a video recorded with this device to test how this microphone behaves in very high volume scenarios, setting the sound system in my room at maximum volume. Fortunately, it does not distort completely, but it is definitely not a microphone capable of picking up very clearly in these environments and even in regular volume environments. The front camera is 8 megapixels with f2 0-point aperture and fixed focus. From the factory, the device does not have any gesture to quickly open the camera, but in the settings you can enable the option to double press the volume down button to access the camera when the device is locked. This camera will have a good behavior in terms of agility when taking pictures. It does not feel that it is very slow, and that can be a positive thing. In the lower right corner, we will be able to access a beauty mode that only has 1 parameter, and we can also access some color filters that we cannot preview in real time simultaneously. Fortunately, in the settings, we can enable the capture with the palm gesture for a much easier capture. And in the full settings, you'll notice that the floating shutter option is not available. Selfies look pretty straightforward both in color and detail. Obviously, we're not looking at a high-end device here, so it's pretty much what we'd expect, but it doesn't come as a surprise. Interestingly, when I moved a little further away from the camera, it improved the balance of highlights and shadows a bit, so I think it's a camera that's better suited to being away from it. Although it is not an exaggeratedly wide camera, so for group photography I think it would not give enough space, but still it is what we could expect from this price. Indoors, the picture loses a lot of detail, so it looks even simpler and slightly paler in color than it should. In backlit scenarios, it does detect that it needs to use HDR, but the preview still looks very burnt. After taking the picture, it does a better balance of highlights and shadows, so I think in this respect it does perform well, even though there are still some slightly overexposed areas, but in this price range we can't get too picky. Finally, at night, the results are going to be as expected. Again, just as we saw in the indoor shots, there is little level of detail and slightly paler colors. And at night, backlit, which is the most difficult scenario, you can tell it's a low-end device, so it's not able to gather much illumination. In fact, if you don't use the screen as a flash simulation, the result is going to be even worse, so it's very basic. But if you still have enough lighting in the evenings, you could also take portrait pictures, and the result still looks okay to me. But if you take these pictures course, in the daytime, you're going to notice how it's not able to detect the objects in the foreground, so it blurs them completely. And as for the face, it also has some levels of inaccuracy in this kind of pictures, so it doesn't seem to be of a good level. It's very basic. On the back, we have 3 cameras, supposedly. The main camera is 28mm with 50 megapixels on its sensor and an f1.8 aperture with autofocus, so it's a camera that has good specs. And in this part, we have 2 other cameras that I call only for decoration or marketing because they are not going to give us much use. Maybe you could rescue the 2 megapixel macro camera with f2.4 aperture, but the other camera doesn't really have any use. Now let's do a test by trying to capture number 3. We're going to make several attempts to be sure we've measured the shutter speed of this device correctly. In my last test, I'm going to observe the screen because I noticed that it has some delay on the screen. So let's do this last test like this. And notice that the results were very variable. On my first attempt, I did come very close to capturing the exact moment. On my second attempt, interestingly enough, I seemed to be ahead of schedule. And on my third attempt, I was also very close. So I think it does have a good photo capture response. In addition, it also has a burst of up to 20 pictures that you can activate by sliding the shutter to the side. In fact, the burst also seems to have a very good response speed to start at the exact moment, although it is not very long. Again, in the lower right corner, we are going to be able to access some color filters. And one thing I don't like is that the macro mode is in a switch format. So if you leave it on, you're not going to realize that you're in macro mode. So pay attention when there's this indicator of a little flower. Otherwise, you're going to think your camera is no longer any good because it's so out of focus. So I don't think it's a good implementation by Xiaomi to have the macro mode to turn on and off. I'd like it to be like another dedicated mode. You can tap the screen to adjust focus and exposure, though it doesn't have a pro mode for further controls, let alone has raw photo capture. For QR code capture, it does have an option from the main camera, but sometimes it takes a long time to recognize the QR code. So probably the most convenient way is to access Google Lens with the shortcut at the top. And once you access Google Lens, it's going to be much easier to scan these types of codes. And note that it also doesn't have a way to scan documents. So for that action, you'll have to download a separate app. The device has a high resolution mode for taking pictures at 50 megapixels, although from my point of view, the pictures don't really look that detailed. So it's not a device that can stand out too much in the level of detail that its main camera achieves, although they are good quality pictures for this price. Even in motion scenarios, the camera seems to perform well enough for not very fast movements. Outdoors, this camera behaves well. The warm tones are adequate, the saturation of the colors as well, and even the level of detail from the automatic mode that has 12 megapixel photographs is positive. In fact, in this main camera, we are going to notice that there is very little distortion and very little chromatic aberration in the edges. So to talk about an economic device, I think the result is really good in this camera. Indoors, the pictures also have good lighting, not too much contrast, so the level of detail is also a bit reduced, but for the price range, I think it's okay. Controlling noise well and still maintaining color saturation well. In backlight, the preview doesn't look optimized, having a completely burned out lit area, but it does detect that it needs HDR. So after taking the picture, notice how it does make a good balance of highlights and shadows, also maintaining a good level of detail, and even notice that very little chromatic aberration is revealed as I was anticipating in this type of photographs. At night, the result is nice, although it will improve a lot if you use the night mode, where it balances well the illuminated areas, and even the darkest areas keeps them with good noise control and good color saturation. Interestingly, Xiaomi allows us to use the zoom mode 2x within the night mode, so you are seeing a picture without night mode and now a picture with night mode, where you will notice how it greatly improves the balance of the brightest areas, maintaining good lighting in the darkest areas. And if we go to night photographs where there are no illuminated areas present, I think the result is simple. If you use the night mode, it does increase the detail a bit, but it's still not high-end photography, although in the price range we couldn't demand it. In fact, notice how if you use zoom, there is a difference between using and not using night mode, but it's still not an overly spectacular photograph. But while we're on the subject of zoom, let me show you some photographs using zoom. First, we are looking at a picture with 1x, and this picture is with 2x, where as you can see, it does not maintain optical quality, so it is not a sensor that is well used in this sense. Now you are looking at a photograph with 5x zoom and then 10x, so you notice that the zoom is completely forced and does not take advantage of the sensor. For macro photography, I find it curious that the macro camera does manage to maintain color saturation saturation well. And I emphasize this because other macro cameras that I have tested from much more expensive devices are not able to saturate colors well. So in this case, I like the results surprisingly. Especially also because with the main camera, for some reason, the pink color became very pale, very strangely. So the result seems to have a problem that should be corrected with a software update. It's also worth noting that it has no ultra-wide camera, nor does it have panorama mode, surprisingly, so there's no way to have wide shots here. And finally, for portrait photography, it's not a good performer. Notice that in this case, having a long exposure, it could result in a photograph with a lot of movement. The lit areas are completely burned out, it doesn't seem to have good detail, so it could improve a lot. For video recording, it is within expectations as it supports full HD video without any additional options. It's a very simple experience. When recording video, you can pause and resume your recording. You can also take pictures while recording. And you have a slider for zooming, but no quick shortcuts to switch between different focal lengths. You also can't turn on the flashlight, and in fact, the marker button that other Xiaomis have available isn't included either. Finally, you also can't rotate to the front camera without first stopping your video recording, so it's very limited in this regard. Video recording will be simple, colors are also simple, but fortunately it doesn't seem to have problems with very aggressive white balance jumps. Exposure could get to vary a bit stronger, but without becoming annoying, so for the price, I think it's a video recording that we can still get to grips with. Indoors, I think it manages to control noise well, while maintaining good color saturation and sufficient lighting. So for the price, it's also something I can come to accept. In backlit conditions, you're going to notice a lot more exposure, jumping around a lot more aggressively. In fact, also the focus can struggle a little bit in these types of environments. So, like all devices in this range, it will not be advisable to record in this type of backlit environments. At night, interestingly, I think it manages to have a good balance in the noise that is present. Obviously, if there is a light source, it will not be able to balance highlights and shadows well. But even in the darker areas, there doesn't seem to be exaggerated noise presence. Obviously, it feels like it's going to a slightly lower frame rate per second to try to gather more light, but for the price range, I think it's still acceptable video quality. Unfortunately, it doesn't have optical stabilization and has very light digital stabilization. In fact, you could say it's almost non-existent. So neither walking, let alone running, you're not going to get a good result. The fast camera is going to be positive. Fortunately, it can go from 4x's, which is useful for recording people's movements, or it can go up to 1800x. So you might even be able to record the growth of some plants. Obviously, it doesn't have stabilization, so you do need to leave the device on a base if you want to get a good result. However, it does not have slow motion, and that could be a negative point. So, in general, video recording, let's say it's simple. The front camera, fortunately, seems to capture colors well, unlike other devices that have very pale colors, although obviously it won't perform well balancing highlights and shadows, so if you're in a backlit environment, you're likely to see some areas appear very overexposed or burnt out altogether, and with no stabilization, it can also be uncomfortable to walk around with so much vibration in the final result. Indoors, it's still a result I consider positive as there doesn't seem to be as much noise and it still seems to maintain good contrast and good color saturation. For the price, I think the front camera does come to give a good result in these types of conditions, and even at night where you obviously lose a bit more color accuracy and there is much less detail. But even so, I think that for the price is a result that we can come to accept. Although note that in the darker areas it's not able to brighten the screen to try to compensate a little bit for the lack of illumination, so that could be improved. With the front camera you also have fast camera, although obviously it's not going to be very attractive, but of a very simple quality. And it doesn't offer slow motion, nor does it offer dual camera. In the software, we will find positive things, as this cell phone finally comes with Android 14 from the factory, or at least at the time of my purchase, it does. And it comes with Hyper OS. So we find the latest from Xiaomi and the latest from Google. Plus, it has 2 years of software updates and 4 years of security patches. And at this price point, it's hard to find many devices that offer you a clear update policy. So in that sense, we do have something positive that could be a strength. One feature that I personally don't like is the lock screen wallpaper carousel. Notice how every time you go to unlock your phone, you will have a different image. I insist that I personally do not like it because there are times when the unlock cover can be quite strange or very opposite to your tastes. That's why I personally prefer to disable it. To do this, you have to enter wallpaper and then wallpaper carousel and finally disable this option. And speaking of the lock screen, remember that in this case it already has Hyper OS customization, so you can quickly switch your lock screen to another customization and explore new types of covers. Some in magazine format, others in a slightly more advanced format. Although in this case it doesn't seem to have the depth detection of your photos for an even more advanced effect. But honestly, it seems to me that you do have a good number of customization options to be able to recreate much nicer lock screens. So this point of lock screen customization seems to me to be a strong point. The device also has some gestures that you could interact with. For example, you can call the Google Assistant by holding down the power button. In fact, it already has Gemini as well that you can get to try out the assistant that is smarter. It also has some gestures for screenshots to turn on the flashlight. I would like to have more customization on all these gestures though. The only gesture that you can customize is to double tap the fingerprint sensor. So that, for example, you can open the camera by simply giving it these two touches. Although being just touches and not presses can become a bit complex to enable it, but it is available. The one-handed mode is the native Android one, which is a copy of the iPhone 1. Too bad because it simply slides up and down, but the areas on the sides are still very difficult to reach. It has screen recorder, and that should be noted because sometimes cheaper devices do not allow you to record the screen. And curiously, in this case, lets you select the resolution and quality that will have these recordings. So it can become something useful for recording tutorials. In this case, unlike many others, Xiaomi doesn't come with Mi Remote because it doesn't have infrared for a universal remote control, so it comes a bit simpler in that regard. Also, evidently that the apex motor will be on the Z-axis, so it's a simple vibration that doesn't offer too much interaction with the system. Let's move on to talk about security, and I'll mention to you that it has a side fingerprint reader that supports up to 5 registrations. The performance seems to be good. It's a bit thin, so you might need to repeat the reading a few times depending on how you get used to it. But it's a reader that works well and fortunately has a good number of registrations so you can have multiple people. So the experience in that sense is good. Also consider that it includes facial unlocking, although it's simple in 2 dimensions, so I wouldn't recommend using it too much. But for convenience, even the device is going to suggest you add your facial data. But if you want to keep the device unlocked in relatively secure environments, you can register Bluetooth devices from Xiaomi such as their wristbands or watches, and as long as it's connected, it's not going to be constantly prompting you to unlock it. Although it doesn't include Google's Extend Unlock, which would allow you to even log locations to keep the device unlocked. So it has a weak point in this regard considering that every Android includes Google Extend Unlock. In this section, you can set your privacy protection password, which is going to serve you for the secure folder inside the file manager. It is a bit hidden, so you have to enter this section and slide down so that finally when you release it, you can access your private data. Also within the security application, you will be able to enable application blocking, so you can determine which applications must verify again through your fingerprint that it is you who is trying to access. You could even set a different unlock pattern to your lock screen and then define the applications. It would also allow you to hide apps. And with regard to the network, it simply provides a way to check what apps on your network are consuming. But it does not include a private VPN to help you keep your connection secure on public Wi-Fi networks. What it does include is a security scan, but it is Xiaomi's own. It doesn't appear to be in collaboration with any cybersecurity company. It does not include the second space mode that is included on other Xiaomi devices. Nor does it allow you to clone apps. And if you happen to lose your cell phone in addition to the Google Find My Device feature, remember that in the Xiaomi account settings comes another section within Xiaomi Cloud, where after enabling a lot of permissions, you will be able to access another more advanced function of Xiaomi to find your phone. But curiously, it comes disabled. So I encourage you to activate it because it can give you more chances to find your phone if you lose it. By the way, the password manager is from Google, and as you realize, it does not first verify through your fingerprint, although you can change that in the settings, so check that because otherwise they could access your passwords very easily. Finally, you already know that you can access the digital wellness and parental controls functions to see how much time you are consuming on certain apps, set times to go to sleep and hours to avoid distractions, and many other things more. And in the security and emergency options, you can define some emergency contacts and additional information. And remember that by pressing the on-off button 5 times, you can make an emergency call. The battery is 5000 milliamperes, and you should know that in this case the device did perform a little more than the average smartphone. So it is a battery that can give you a good performance, in conjunction obviously with a processor that does not have as much power and therefore will not consume as much energy. In my test, if it did get over 5 hours in my background test, so I tell you that if you get to excel over several rivals in this aspect. It also comes with different power modes such as balanced, an economizer mode that could help you further extend your battery life, and even for emergency occasions there is also available the Ultra Saver mode that will restrict all kinds of options on your phone, but it still gives you access to 2 apps that you deem essential. Although believe me, there are other devices that give you access to more essential apps, but this mode comes even more limited. But while we have a battery that could be considered good, in the charging section it's not going to be that much. It is a charger of only 10 watts, although the manufacturer claims that this device supports 18 watts charging. But in the box they integrate you only this simple charger, and using this charger with 15 minutes of charging it reached only 12% in my test. With 30 minutes it got up to 23%. And the full charge was completed in 152 minutes. That's 2.5 hours, and it's definitely not going to excel in this regard. And if you plan to leave it charging overnight, remember that in this case it doesn't offer any battery protection mechanism. It just gives you information. But there are other devices that offer you smart charging or charging lock. But Xiaomi curiously does not give us more tools to take care of our battery, so if you leave it charging all night it could degrade faster this battery. In connectivity, we will find support for 4G networks, so it is not something so advanced, but it was expected in this price range. It also doesn't come with eSIM support, so if you are going on a trip, you will have to purchase physical SIM cards. It also has Wi-Fi 5, able to give us a good download speed for the price range, and it also has Bluetooth 5.3 for good stability with your accessories. However, it does not have NFC. So you would not be able to make mobile payments from this device, but fortunately it does come with FM radio, although obviously you need to connect headphones to it to work as an antenna. It is also capable of advanced screen projection. That is, you can hide notifications on the projection, or you could also project only one application, or project with the screen off. And finally, it also brings another simple mirror projection option. So you have 2 projection options that work properly. Obviously, it's not capable of getting signal out through its USB-C connector, but you can connect through Android Auto cable or wirelessly as well. And something that can be considered a strong point are the sensors, because it does include accelerometer, geomagnetic field sensor, and orientation sensor, also a good light sensor, although the proximity sensor is completely virtual. And it can be a bit complex to activate it, so it might give you a bit inconsistent performance. It also has gravity and linear acceleration sensor, in addition to the rotation vector. So compared to other entry-level devices, I think it offers us a good number of sensors. In ecosystem, we will also find a very prominent point, because it is a device full of options to connect with other devices. Remember that Xiaomi is the manufacturer that possibly offers the largest number of devices of the same brand for other conditions. That is, in addition to tablets, watches, bracelets, and headphones. It has many more accessories. In fact, they also have laptops, although in Mexico and in many other countries those laptops are not available. But despite having a lot of smart devices that you can connect to the cell phone, they don't really have such an advanced interaction. That is, even though you have a cell phone of the same brand, the interaction would be the same as what you would have on other devices from other brands. Installing Xiaomi Home, so it doesn't get to take advantage of being the device of the same brand. Curiously, in this case, does not integrate Mi Share, but only Quick Share to share files with other Android devices, and it also integrates Google Fast Pair to connect quickly with headphones of other brands. In fact, it relies heavily on Google in several ways, as in cloud storage. So you'll have Google Photos and Google Drive as the main players. Xiaomi Cloud has disappeared on this side of the world, so you won't be able to use it. So the Xiaomi experience feels very dependent on Google still. Hopefully Xiaomi can give us something more advanced in the future. Let's talk about the performance. The processor is the MediaTek Helio G85, a very common processor in this range. In past years, you would obviously find it in more expensive devices, but it is good news that in entry series devices we start to see the processor, although it is accompanied by 4 GB of RAM. So as you open more applications, the device obviously gets slower. You can put up to 4 GB of virtual RAM. But honestly, Xiaomi's virtual RAM doesn't seem to perform well. In fact, note that in this case my stopwatch totally froze. And on average it clearly will take more than 6 seconds to open each of these apps. And I only opened 12 apps and not 16 as we usually test. So it's pretty clear that this device is not really aimed at people who want maximum speed. Note that you might encounter some restarts when returning to certain applications. Although note that in some other cases it seems to have been able to keep the applications running. But most of the time you will see restarts if you have a lot of applications open, so it's a device meant to only open 4 or maximum 5 apps at the same time, because otherwise it's going to give you very poor performance, and that's definitely not going to be something nice for you as a user. In this case I was testing it with 2 gigabytes of additional RAM. But I insist, it doesn't seem to give us very good performance. It also has 128 gigabytes of storage. Fortunately, you can put a micro SD card, so on the storage, I wouldn't worry too much, since we do have a good enough space. Although, obviously, if you install a lot of heavy apps and games, you could get to fill it up a little fast, especially nowadays that applications are getting heavier and heavier. But if you move all your photos and videos to the memory card, you could end up having a good experience. And as another performance test, let's put to export these videos recorded with this device in full HD. They have a total duration of 1 minute, and they've all been recorded in this same resolution as well. Let's wait to see how long it takes. And that's it. It took about 33 seconds. I think it's going to give us a good experience editing videos in full HD. Just remember to only have this application open though, to have a good performance. For games, curiously in this device we will not find the game space function, so there are no additional tools when playing games. As you can see, it is a cut version of HyperOS. Even the quick settings section is completely different. Unfortunately, this device did not let itself be monitored in a specific way. As for your frames per second, in Call of Duty by default loads in low graphics quality at a medium frame rate, but it allows us to go up to medium graphics quality with a high rate. Obviously, many graphical effects will not be available, because this is a simple device with a processor that is not very modern, and it is not aimed at powerful devices. But despite not allowing specific monitoring of frames per second, we can say that it does give us a considerably good performance. It is not free of some small hitches, but it practically goes at 40 frames per second, only with an at-a-glance calculation. But honestly, it goes quite well. When recording the screen, it can get a little more complicated, with a little bit more noticeable hitches, but I think it helps to have an HD screen. If it had a full HD screen, maybe it would be a little more complicated to move these graphics, but for now I think the performance can be acceptable. In the Legends game we changed the automatic setting for a low setting at 60 frames per second. And again, we don't have specific monitoring, but what we can get to notice is that the warming can get to be quite high, exceeding 44 degrees Celsius, so it is not a device so recommended to play, due to the heating that comes to generate. And even considering that in this case we have the graphics quality selected, we're going to notice that if you record the screen, you can perceive some hitches a little more constant. Although you can still get to have a good enough experience when playing. The ideal is to play without recording the screen, for a much better performance, but let it be clear that this device is not intended for those who like to play games a lot. For that case, better buy the Poco M6 Pro that I told you at the beginning of the video. On this occasion, we also tested Free Fire, selecting the ultra graphics quality, activating also the high resolution mode, activating the shadows, putting some special filters, and activating the high frames per second. And in this case, again, the temperature became high. It seems that it does reach 60 frames per second in several areas of the game, although obviously it is not able to maintain much stability, but it can still become an acceptable experience. In fact, even recording the screen, we could say that the experience can still become smooth. So despite not being a gaming specialist, I think it doesn't disappoint at all, especially if you are willing to play simple content and without very advanced graphics. And finally, we played Asphalt 9, one of the most optimized games. In this case, we selected 60 frames per second, and we also selected the best graphics quality setting. Although remember that even having the best graphics quality setting, it is a different setting depending on the range of the device, so we are not going to find very advanced explosions or smoke or water drops that we would find in devices with more powerful processors. But even recording the screen is going to run this game well, apparently if it gets to be close to 60 frames per second. But I repeat, you are not going to be able to enjoy very advanced graphics if you are not interested in that, if you could get to have a good gaming experience. So that's it for this video. This device seems balanced to me, but unfortunately in Mexico its launch price is very high. I think if it was close to 2,000 Mexican pesos, it would be much more attractive. So if you find it at a similar price to the one I mentioned, it could be a better option. For now, this has been all. I hope you liked it. If you did, you know you can tell me about it, and we'll see you next time.